Hello, everyone. Welcome to the WEI Tech Talk podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Murphy. I'm a solutions architect here at WEI, and I focus on all things cybersecurity. My background is in incident response and threat hunting. So a topic inside of cybersecurity that's near and dear to my heart is that of SOC modernization. So thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be covering a number of topics around SOC modernization, like artificial intelligence, the growth rate of data, and ultimately the democratization of that data and how that can benefit organizations that we work with. I'm super excited to welcome our guest of honor today, Myke Lyons. Hello, welcome to the podcast. Can you
How you
quickly
doing, Shawn?
introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Myke Lyons, as Shawn said. So I'm a CISO at a company called Cribl, which is the data pipeline tool for IT and security data, more specifically. I have been a CISO a few times. I was at a data management company called Cribl, as well as the CISO at Sneak, prior to joining Cribl. And small little tidbit about why Cribl for me. I got my start in logging. That was my first job in security, was to deal with logs. And so come full circle, I am now empathizing with those folks and dealing with what they are dealing with, or at least seeing what they're dealing with, which is a significant amount more of logs.
Before we get started, Myke, I wanted to ask you a question that I love asking cybersecurity pros because I always get interesting answers, and that is, how did you get your start in cybersecurity?
So I definitely followed the natural path everyone else follows, which is I went to culinary school.
Of course.
And I learned, yeah, that's how you do it, right? I learned classical French cooking with a smattering of classical Chinese cooking, from there, very quickly just transitioned right into a CISO role.
Okay, excellent. That's a repeatable path to success, I suppose. Well, that's interesting that you have a background in the culinary arts. I happen to live on a small farm in Connecticut, and we grow all sorts of produce that we can sell into our local markets. And one of my favorite customers happens to be a local chef who values, seasonal local produce. So it's very cool that we have that in common. You should swing by the farm
I,
sometime.
I'd love to swing by the farm. I'd love to join your CSA, and I feel like I'm going to be driving. So we've talked earlier about what states we lived in. We both live in Connecticut. I'll be driving by your house at some point throughout the winter, headed up to Vermont to play in the snow.
Perfect.
Maybe I'll come by for what's your favorite crop you're growing right now?
Well, it's late in the season, so we don't have a lot going. We've got some of our winter crops like carrots and kale, and we have some beans in one of our tunnel. My favorite crop of all, and something that Connecticut is low-key very good at, is cantaloupe. Cantaloupe, you always think of it in like a mixed fruit bowl as being like the filler, the least cool thing in the fruit bowl. Good cantaloupe that's like not grown to be shipped halfway across the world is unreal. So when you swing by next time, we grow two types of cantaloupe. One of them is like a personal size cantaloupe. You cut it in half, scoop out the seeds, put a little scoop of ice cream, vanilla ice cream in the middle, and it's the best dessert you will ever have. Okay, so let's launch into the topic at hand, which is SOC modernization. And one area that we chatted about off camera that you seem really passionate about is artificial intelligence. I totally agree that I think we went through this whole shift to the data economy, and I think we're going to go through a similar shift to artificial intelligence economy. So I wanted to just open it up to you to talk a little bit about AI architecture or AI use cases, whichever way you want to go, and I can roll with the punches.
Yeah. So everyone's favorite two letters has probably been their favorite two letters for about 36 months, pretty much right around when ChatGPT 3 came out and everyone lost their minds, myself included. My use case was originally like, I'm going to build this company and we're going to respond to security questionnaires using a GenAI tool because I hate security questionnaires, and so does everyone else. Um, but I think on that front, it was like, well, how do we as security people go from this, oh my gosh, they're asking us to go and explore this new technology that they don't even know about, and they're expecting us to be experts on it. And if we give it all of our secrets, then it will not expose our secrets.
Mhm.
Two, every banker, every investor, and every company out there sort of saying, if you aren't using AI, you're not doing the right things by your business, your shareholders, your constituents. And I think as security people, we tend to get buzzword bingo fatigued earlier than most, mostly because I think we're um, aware of tech because I think most of us, you have to be a technologist to be in security. Um, but also, people want to make better decisions today, and so they started to ask us questions about AI, and we started to ask questions of ourselves, like, "Hey, are we missing the boat on this?" Because our brethren over in the ops team is starting to look at interesting things. So I think for SOC analysts, who are, like we've always said, inundated with constant alerts and blinky lights and things like that, that there is a way to improve their daily lives using a Gen AI technology and using Gen AI technologies. And I'll tell you right out of the gate that here at Cribl, we're using one. We're early doors. We've been using it for, it's December when we're recording this, so we've been using it since about September, um, and we're using it in an isolated way. And I'm pretty psyched about it.
Hmm. So that's an interesting topic. I recently attended the Advanced Cybersecurity Center's um, track on AI and incident response. And well, first, I have two comments on that. First is I was really surprised at the number of CISOs that are just shutting the door on AI because they're afraid of what you mentioned at the top of your response there about the privacy implications, the confidentiality implications. So they just block access to all of those Gen AI tools. And I had to raise my hand and argue pretty forcefully that if you don't start using it now, then you're going to be at a significant disadvantage compared to the attacker because they're using it. They don't have any of those confidentiality concerns or any of those privacy concerns. They're using whatever's at their fingertips, and they're not having policy discussions and waiting for legal guidelines. So I'm curious your thoughts since you're a CISO. Do you struggle with that balance between the risks and the rewards?
100%. But I'm also recognizing that if I was to come in and pull the proverbial e-brake on all AI technologies, that my whoever was going to follow me in the door would be picking up and releasing that e-brake and moving on, and I'd be going to go find a different job, because we absolutely need to explore and prove that the wholesale of AI is not going to work for an entire company, um, which is, it's not the case. And then maybe the second thing, and maybe there's one more after that, is that a lot of the tech that we use on a day-to-day basis, right? Salesforce, or Slack, or Google Docs or something like that, those have a lot of AI technologies brought in already. They're pretty prolific, and they're using the data that you've already provided to them. So perhaps you can look and explore about how your license allows them to use those data for training. And I think, thirdly, there is a way that you can govern data for better usage with technologies out there like AI. And I think the starting point is, if you don't know what you have in it, well, then don't point it at the giant thing. Maybe just put it at a sliver of a use case and explore what the possibilities are. Um, or the alternative is you could go on premise, which is something that we did. So
Hmm.
because we were going to point it at all of our documentation and all of our issues tracking and a number of other technologies we had, we decided that this was something we could host on our own. And sure, so we're paying the hosting costs for it, which is, it's not significant, but it just allowed us to limit some of that risk. And working with that vendor is actually it's actually working out pretty well.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that seemed to be the consensus that if you're going to go down this path, you need to bring it in-house and make it local. There was some discussion of front-ending SaaS AI services with a sort of portal where you could enter your prompt and then it would be logged and there would be some policy enforcement and then it would push it out to the SaaS service. That seemed like a sort of complicated architecture to me. And then there was also a startup in the session that focused on AI firewalls. They said, "Hey, you would never deploy a website without a WAF in front of it. How can you possibly deploy an AI model without an AI firewall in front of it?" But that seemed like very new and emerging tech I hadn't heard of before.
That's what I've heard as well. Yeah, I think that solves your users misusing these technologies. So that almost implies that, sure, we have protections for malice. What I don't think that some of those firewall type technologies, are going to help you solve are the hallucinations or
Mm,
typos. There's ways that you can get information you didn't know was there. It's just provided to you, as a result. There's been some interesting, discoveries that I don't know if you've been following on X or Blue Sky or whatever your favorite small message based social media consumption is. But there's this challenge right now with ChatGPT and OpenAI where there's a particular name that it won't say,
mm,
and it's a name interestingly on a terrorist watch list, and we don't really know why. This person actually, there's a couple people with this name. It's not like a super unique name, but this individual someone actually borrowed this name. It was a Chechen rebel that borrowed this name at one point and tried traveling the world, and so they were put on this list. But there's been a whole group of people that are just doing all sorts of prompt injection to try to get ChatGPT to say the name, and it's quite fun to watch. And I say that because there's effectively a firewall there that everyone is interacting with. And what are they doing? Like, they're going after the taboo,
yeah,
almost as for humor's sake.
it's like they're brute forcing it. Yeah, very interesting. You also mentioned in your initial response to the question about overall generally how AI is being used to modernize the SOC related use cases. Do you mind digging into that a little bit? How is your SOC using AI, for example?
So our current usage, it's a bit nascent. We actually use it across a few different technologies that we have. But my desire for the coming year, for this next calendar year, is that we are contextualizing alerts way faster, and we are slowly unlocking additional use cases that are based on what my analyst would do as step one, step two, step three of any of their triaging. So if you think about what we were hoping for with SOAR technologies, and where we were expecting those things to go, I would anticipate that these technologies will surpass the context-based SOAR lookups right out of the gate. I do not think, however, like SOAR is going to go and impact a change or actually block something or close a port or modify a configuration. I don't think we're going to be adopting Gen AI next. At least I'm not going to be adopting Gen AI to do that work in the next 12 months. Could I in the future? Absolutely. So specifically, the use cases. One, we all live in the SIM world as security security analysts more than me. Thankfully now I'm no longer doing that, but being able to build queries quickly that can be
Mhm.
very complicated. I think a big goal for my team, what I would like for them to do is to be able to interact with their data and sort of have a conversation with it, which for earlier analysts is actually quite quite good because they kind of know what question they want to ask. They don't want to be munging together a series of KQL to get the thing right. And so there's definitely a great use case there for Gen AI. It's a low risk use case as well. We within Cribl, where I work, we actually have a quote unquote copilot. It actually is called Copilot, but effectively that's what it does. It just helps remove the prompts. I remember being with a large retail firm when I first joined Cribl, and there were two women sitting next to me that were both early SOC analysts, and the one next to me, you could hear her fingers slowly getting louder and louder on the keyboard as she was staring at a SIM technology, and She was just banging away and banging away, and she was whispering to her friend because we were in a bigger meeting, and she was whispering to or I'm assuming they were friends, the person next to her, and they were sort of chuckling, and you could see the frustration on the one person's voice, and you could see the other one was a little more senior because she was sort of like, yeah, just like hit that. Oh, this is where your line is, and for me, I'm like, what a waste of time these two people are having to go through. Like these, clearly brilliant people, clearly know what they want to do. Why are they fumbling through syntax
Hmm.
so significantly? So I think that's a big use case that should almost be used tomorrow. And I don't even think you need to buy a technology necessarily to do that. I mean, ours is available, but for our use case, I think you could use ChatGPT. You could use one of the, Anthropic to do it. You could use a number of different technologies to do it. And then I have another
Awesome.
one, but I want you to, if anything you want to add to that.
Oh, I'm taking notes. I need to circle back to SOAR because I'm a big SOAR guy. I have been since the early days, actually the basically beginning of the market segment. So I want to hammer on that a little bit and ask you some questions. But I'd like to hear your last use case.
Yeah, sure. So the other use case is being able to query your documentation. So think
Hmm.
about when you're dealing with an incident and it's a system that you know a little bit about, but you don't know a whole ton about it, and you're trying to troubleshoot it and go through some initial things. What do? You kind of find the expert. You kind of find the person, the know-it-all, the that hero that exists within your business, and you ask them a series of questions, or because you don't know that person, you start to plug away and search Jira and Confluence and all these other texts, and you start writing those queries and trying to find things out because
Or
you don't have
Slack.
the context. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
a source of the unsettled source of truth in most organizations, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So we're looking at plugging those technologies into the Gen AI. So when an alert comes in, you're not asking it what this service does. The Gen AI is like, hey, this is, Abacus, and Abacus is a calculations application that we use to calculate how much, and I'm making this application up on the fly here, so it might fail, but effectively how much, compute you're using on a daily basis, and queries and data volumes and all that sort of stuff. That's Abacus. It's owned by, Sally Smith, and she's the architect, and she's based in, Michigan or something, whatever. Like, wouldn't that be amazing to know that information's there? So the alert comes in, it's the typical alert you're very comfortable with seeing, but then you get this like green colored application. Like the Abacus name is like green in color because it's like, hey, we know a lot about that, and I've been able to pull this information. So it starts to like reduce the unknowns right out of the gate from an alerting perspective. So that's maybe the second big use case and opportunity.
Yeah, I'm super excited about that. I used to talk about, so you mentioned the failures of SOAR in some respects, and I think that boiled down to they were super structured. Like you had to have a very detailed flow chart, and if that flow chart broke for whatever reason, the whole playbook would just stop because it didn't know how to proceed. And that's the beautiful thing about AI is it can operate in those unknown circumstances and say, this is the best we have. And that's better than what you're going to get from a SOAR tool 99% of the time. And I love the idea of sort of synthesizing your rock star analyst. This was something that was popular, I don't know, a decade ago, but where you would have the one person on the crew who could stumble into work at like 10 a.m. He had a blue mohawk and wore a like ripped up black t-shirt and just didn't care. And that person, because they had been around for so long, they had this sort of tribal knowledge, and you could just ask them a question, and they'd be like, "I know exactly what the problem is. It's the proxy. You need to go do this thing." And if you could somehow take that person's brain and put it into an AI and give them not just like sort of niche expertise, but know the whole organization, that would be insanely powerful. Um,
we we in another life, in a historical life, we worked with a vendor, and the CEO of the company, she was a big advocate for killing your heroes, which was
Yeah.
sort of her selling pitch was to kill your heroes. We have one of those heroes, and I definitely do not want to see him die. I love him, and but his nickname, coincidentally, with your Mohawk analogy there, we nicknamed him Rockstar Gandalf. Was his nickname.
Oh wow, he's a wizard too. Wow. Rockstar wizard.
Very
That's
fitting. Very fitting for
He
the
just
hero.
needs a unicorn horn. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
exactly.
Another thing that you touched on that I wanted to circle back to, and this kind of goes to how you got your start in cybersecurity, is I also did not study anything technical. I studied philosophy. I went to graduate school for philosophy. I wanted to become a philosophy professor. I thought I was going to be a philosopher until I realized there are no philosophers anymore. It's literally impossible to get a job in philosophy. So I fell back on my IT skills and I ended up here in cybersecurity. And I was always a little self-conscious about that lack of technical background. But now, because of I don't need to know Python. I don't need to know regex. I don't need to be a wizard. I can just ask AI to generate that code for me. And what's more important is asking good questions of the AI. And what do philosophers do? Philosophers ask questions. So now I don't feel so self-conscious about my background, and I fly that philosophy flag very proudly. So I thought that was interesting.
It is. I think it's great that you contextualize it. I'm actually currently reading a philosophy book, which is stressing me out quite significantly, as philosophy books are meant to do.
Is it about the existential threats of AI?
No, I got through all of that already.
Okay,
I
good.
am a big fan of Super Intelligence by Nick Bostrom. That's a really good book.
Yeah,
No,
I'll mention
it's the
this.
theory of moral sentiments. It's actually way
Adam
more
Smith.
internal. It's Adam Smith. Yeah, yeah. It's not a new
Yeah.
book. I wish I read the abridged version because holy smokes, is it yeah, it's really good for holding doors open as well. Um,
Everyone starts with the wealth of nations, but the theory of moral sentiments,
moral
yeah,
sentiments,
the
moral
theory of moral
sentiments. Yeah.
sentiments is, I think, very underappreciated work. So good on you.
Cheers. So, to that end, though, to interrogating, and maybe to bring my own career, my original career, back into the fold as it pertains to SOAR and additional things, recipes or workflows.
Oh yeah.
I So I spent 8 years at ServiceNow. I was responsible for their SOAR product, which was exceptionally rigid and intentionally rigid because their consumers were very heavily focused on change management. And most of the SOAR use cases were action oriented, doing things, blocking a process on a node, or actually really an endpoint, or um, updating a block list, a spam block list, or null routing a DNS entry, or null routing something, right, in some way. I call it null routing, but I'm just genericizing the idea. And those things could have impact for the business, and so we were intentionally rigid. What I think was lacking also is that you were basing it off a perfect rule. So the rule had to be super accurate and really good, and the only AI quote actually was really machine learning stuff, and still much of this is as well. The machine learning that we were trusting were the endpoint, the next gen endpoint technologies, and so those were the ones that we had the most faith in at the time. And I think that was where a lot of that rigidity was required. Now, as we're progressing and we have much better access to data, excuse me, I think we'll be able to get to a point where these AI SOC analysts will have, or will at the very least be able to provide you with a whole slew of additional information that previously was just unavailable to you. So I think it's just the modernization of technology and growth and access to data.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of something else you mentioned in your story about the two SOC analysts that were banging on a query and just spent most of their mental energy trying to figure out how to write the query, not analyzing the data. The miracle of the human brain is the ability to make judgments and decipher the data and figure out what to do about that data. It's not to write the query and wait like 5 hours for Splunk to return results, for example. So yeah, I think having those AI agents sort of built into the tools that you're using is very powerful. Um, One other thing that we talked about in our prep call was the quality of data, and I wanted to run a sort of question slash topic by you because one of the most powerful features of the SOAR tool I worked on for a long time was the ability to, the way I put it was harvest authentic human generated content. And that's kind of a mouthful, but what I mean by it is when an analyst goes in and marks a case as a false positive, for example, it's a really simple example, that's like a human judgment. Somebody was behind the wheel and fought to do that, and there's an awesome opportunity to capture that activity and use it to feed an AI model. So the next time you get an alert, it can say there's a 92% chance this is a false positive, and maybe it gives you all these weighted components that go into that decision. So, what are your thoughts about like quality of data and what types of data we should be harvesting? And should it be human generated or should it be data generate or uh, you know generated by machines? What are your thoughts there? That's a big
I
topic.
just let the machines take over.
Yeah, exactly.
And go for the ride. I'll be going around in a Waymo later, so we will be letting the machines take over. So I we are looking. We are no, we're not looking. We are using human in the loop education process, right? So we are thumbing the scale a little bit, if you will. And we're doing that through some of the tickets that we have. So if there's a ticket that's generated and the AI SOC is generating, the AI agent is generating a ticket that's related to a security investigation, this process will effectively, elevate that to us, and my analyst will go in and have a look at it, and hey, this is, this is right, this is wrong, whatever the case may be. So it's really helping to educate the system itself, so it'll better weight those particular results that what we had done and what investigations we had done. And I think that's really the only way to go, especially because there's additional context, like to go back to sort of the Nick Bostrom scenario, right? The less information you give the AI access to, the less capable its decisions or accurate its decisions will definitely be. However, there's obviously a significant amount of risks also available as you expose those data. So I think that's a very important part of it. The other thing is, even though machines are generating a lot of the data that we're using for these use cases around AI SOC, they're also sometimes not the best. So you could say quality or normalization would maybe even be what I'm seeing as an initial high quality use case. So I actually was with someone a couple months ago now, and they were going through a conversation with me around a particular product that they had acquired. It's a company that we all know. I'll keep them nameless for the sake of this, but they had acquired a tech that was acquired, that was acquired, that was acquired. Right, so it was a 4 times acquired technology, and that's not super uncommon in the security world. But what was an interesting challenge was that every one of those acquirers were doing wraps. They do log wraps. So they take a log entry that was generated by the initial technology, and then they wrap it with their logging standard. And then
Mm,
that happened again and again and again. So there were 4 date and timestamps of mixed versions of those things, right? They didn't like follow the ISO 8601's date and time format, or they didn't choose Linux time. They just, every time someone was like, well, I'm in San Diego, and so I like day, I like month, day, year. It's like, well,
mhm,
fantastic, that's not sortable, so this will be great. So
mhm.
effectively what we were trying to do, and this was something we were working with them on as a customer of ours, was actually taking out all of those things, which were about 80% of every single log that was being generated, and putting in a very easy computable, date and time stamps, switching over to Unix time, being able to send those things off. The other side of that coin is that if you just to chuck a bunch of data at these particular algorithms, in some cases they're not really, these things aren't going to necessarily add value, and you may be exposing other data attributes you don't necessarily need. So if you're trying to determine what normalcy looks like, you don't necessarily need the full payload at the end of that, because you're looking primarily at we'll say date and time, system category, and some additional pieces of metadata. And so metadata is obviously a little less sensitive to the business, and it should be. And so if you can provide metadata only related attributes over to a system, that should start to produce pretty reasonable things. That should help with adoptability because you are in fact governing your data. And I say data governance, and having worked at a data governance company for 4 years, I don't mean it in that exact context. However, there are capabilities where you could take those things and then ship them off to a lower risk location. And then you might let some of your data scientists have at it in many ways because you are not necessarily going to be exposed if it's accidentally put in the wrong place or if it generates an oddball hallucination.
Awesome. That I like the concept of metadata. I got my start in full packet capture, and full packet capture is ginormous. So the tools that we used were often looking at the full PCAP, extracting some metadata. And then to your point, that does like 90% of the work, but it's significantly smaller. And to your point, it's significantly less risky. So I think that's a good use case. So switching to the second topic that I wanted to dig into a little bit, and this is sort of a good follow on. I wanted to pose a question. What is the average year-over-year growth rate of data for customers that you're working with? And I'd love for you to speculate as to why you think that it's growing at the way it is.
So not my data point, definitely others that kind of do this for a living. So I reasonably trust the number, but it's a 28% CAGR,
Hmm.
and there's no sign of that adjusting at this phase. It might actually be going in the northbound way. Um, so quite a significant number there. The reason, I think, the proliferation. First off, we're way more acutely aware of what's going on in our systems than we ever have been. We recognize that data, there was a long time where people were calling it data is the new oil. I think that a lot of people were saying and adjusting to saying like things like maybe data is a little bit more like water in that it can flow around and move along.
Hmm.
We aren't necessarily needing to delete our data anymore because storage has decreased in general cost so significantly. And so we're actually even making copies of those data. And I think that we're also looking to get ahead of the proverbial bad guys. And I think that leads us towards things like security data lakes, which 5 years ago were all the rage, and we were all going to be running them on Hadoop,
Yep.
and we were going to
Hadoop.
solve world peace. Yep.
Hmm.
We ended up with world peas as opposed to world peace. And I think that there have been a couple of other throws at it, some interesting, but we're still seeing mostly people looking at SIEM technologies. I think that's been generally an accepted scenario. Now, there's no small amount of complexities when it comes to SIEMs themselves, and I think you and I, Shawn, were talking about maybe even related to what I was just talking about with the metadata. So you've got your data lakes, which tend to be swampy in nature if you're not very careful with them and keep them clean. And then my new favorite phrase is the data puddles idea. And I think that data puddles have a place. I think they have a real potential to unlock the value of machine learning and help you determine whether or not what you're thinking about is going to work or not. So it's really going to help with adoption and use cases there.
I love the data puddles and data swamps. I think that's a great analogy. And I haven't thought about the idea that data is less like oil because it's a stock, I think is the way you would put that, or a limited resource that you use and then it's gone. It's more like a cycle, like the water cycle. I like that idea. So the reason I was curious about the growth rate of data, and thank you for speculating as to why it's growing and how it's growing and how it's being used, is because as I mentioned, with my background in incident response and threat hunting, the very first question we would ask if we got engaged with a customer is, where's the data? Like we need access to all of your tools to start doing our forensic work. And 9 times out of 10, they didn't have the data, or we spent a lot of time looking for that data, which led to, I think, a posture where organizations that were mature and were thinking about security proactively had this sort of hungry hippo attitude towards data. Like if it generates logs, send it into the SIM. We don't care like where it's coming from, just like, this thing's going to gobble it all up and we'll figure out what to do with it later. And a lot of organizations realize, to your point about, log messages with a bunch of unused fields, that this is getting expensive, and also it's not valuable because it's so messy in there. So you have to, wade through that data swamp, as you put it. And so at WEI, this is my short company plug. At WEI, we have a whole team of engineers with expertise in major SIMs and in Cribl, of course. And we're helping customers sort of swing the pendulum back into asking, what kind of data do you need to accomplish the outcome you're trying to accomplish? What could you reasonably need in those database logs on that one system that you've been collecting for 15 years? um, and sort of trimming away the data that's not necessary. And I'll just mention a couple of cool features. This isn't a product plug, but I love it and I use it all the time. But the ability to sort of summarize data, so like net flow data, your switches are sending you tons of net flow. Why don't we summarize that into a single message to say, over the past 10 minutes, here's what happened. And then, in the very unlikely situation where you need it, you've got a sort of metadata version of what happened at a fraction of the cost. Um, and there's all sorts of other cool use cases that can help you keep that data swamp a little bit less swampy.
I think you can also get some of those data that you wouldn't necessarily have. And so one thing that I'm experiencing pretty significantly within our customer base is that they want to unlock additional use cases for their SIM, or
Mm,
unlock or send new data to their SIM. However, the budgets are not aligned to the 28% growth, right? That's just not where the SIM budgets are going. And so they are being asked to do more with the same. I wouldn't necessarily say that security teams are generally being asked to shrink unless the business has other challenges, and then that's unrelated. But I don't think that people look at cutting their security budget as the first mechanism. They look at things a little bit differently. However, that said, not all of the sources that are generating data and sending them are generating all valuable data as it pertains to the SIM use cases. So being able to either do things like compress or truncate or normalize, or be more selective. So maybe an example would be, this is a log entry that is being generated by this system that I must keep for a compliance use case. And so say it's a New York Department of Financial Services related activity that I have to keep it for 7 years, but I'm not going to use that in the SIM. I need to be able to search it at a later date. Why don't I skip the SIM entirely and ship that off to a cheaper storage opportunity? Again, I think there's a governance play in that. I think it's governance is kind of what I'm hearing, and maybe we're not calling it because governance has a tendency of being a bad word,
mhm,
especially with most of the cool kids. But I think that there's something there for reducing producing that and making it slightly more effective. The second thing that does, or maybe the reason I was sort of going down this path, was that you were mentioning NetFlow. I was thinking CloudTrail or CloudFlow, all those sorts of things. Those are really chatty logs, like
mhm,
really noisy logs, and they get. I think we're doing like 60 days right now, and I'm looking at that going, that's a big number, like a really big number. And so, excuse me, for us, if I can give someone access to, say, a period of time of those logs, which are super critical when you're dealing with a security incident, like those initial, like what is going on scenarios, to have access to those flow logs is just amazing. It just gives you and really unlocks visibility. But you're not going to go and investigate an incident from 2 months ago or 3 months ago and anticipate that you're going to have access to those flow data. Like it's just you're clearly, at this point, you've likely already dealt with the situation, or
mhm.
you haven't and you have current. And so unlocking the potential within the SIM to be able to get those really critical data for just that like initial response when you have a live one or a hot one or whatever you want to call it. Those are really important. And I think by better scrutinizing the data you send to your SIM, that unlocks and keeps your budget maybe flat, maybe even overall reduces your budget or required, your spend within your particular SIM. I think there's just it's a great opportunity. There's a great opportunity in that.
Yeah. And you mentioned something about governance type use cases. I'm seeing a huge shift towards looking at all the different compliance regulations that you're trying to satisfy, and the logging requirements for all of them are so fractured and disjointed, and you have to store authentication logs for 5 years over here, but you only need a month's worth of data for certain applications. To your point, for if you've been owned for more than a month or two, you've got bigger fish to fry, and figuring out how they got in the front door is kind of a low priority at this point. So retention is a topic that I talk about with customers all the time, and what they tend to do is find the highest retention requirement of all their regs and then apply that to all of their data. And they're quickly realizing that it gets insanely expensive if you do that. So yeah, I like having the flexibility of sending data where it needs to go for what purpose it was intended for, which sort of leads into the last topic, which we can quickly touch on. And this was based on a blog post that I saw Cribl release some time ago, and the concept stuck with me, and I've been thinking about it a bunch ever since. And it's the idea of the democratization of data, and I think part of it has to go to this sort of compliance retention use case, but another part of it in my mind had to do with other business units that can benefit from the data. So I don't know if you want to speak to any stories you have of the democratization of data in the field.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds awesome, right? The
Yeah,
democratization of data.
it's
What a
it's
great
super
phrase.
cool.
We nailed it with that title. So I think so I guess maybe two or three things that I'm hearing, seeing, witnessing on a fairly continuous basis. The first one is that teams are separate, and this is because they have separate functions, right? This isn't like security teams being separate or IT teams being separate. Just teams generally are separate, and there's different use cases for these things. I was talking to a security architect. I was actually talking to a whole bunch of financial institutions in New York. We were doing a fireside chat, and one of the topics came up about dealing with incidents and trying to respond to certain incidents. And there were multiple ops teams because this ops team was focused on this area of the business, and this ops team was focused on another one. And they were saying, look, we have access to the system that generated the log. So the data is not the risk here, but that system that they're using to collect all of those logs is heavily governed because it falls under all these various regulations that they have as a business. And so to unlock, we'll just call it Sam over here and Pat over here, to give Sam access to Pat's system, Pat has to go through an entire process in order to unlock that. And Pat knows full well that Sam should have access to the data. Now, maybe they can do a data dump, but then, Pat's under the gun for a bunch of other stuff. And therefore, she doesn't want to have to deal with, she just doesn't want to have to deal with Sam's request. She'd prefer to move it on. So I think that democratization in one way is to allow a particular system or a business, an end system, to be able to send data depending on the usage, depending on the needs, to various places across the business. What that also unlocks, so the next phase of this, what that unlocks is, one of the largest conversations I have on a continuous basis is people migrating from SIM A to SIM B. And they are doing it fairly continuously. And that is obviously, the public information around Sentinel's growth is quite significant, and there's so many other vendors out there. And people are struggling with the costs associated, and they don't necessarily feel like they're getting the most value from their SIM, so they're looking to move. And there's forced SIM migrations, right? There was an acquisition of a SIM, and we're going to deprecate this thing, and now you got to move and all that. And so how do you do that? Well, you roll out a configuration change, node by node or host by host or config by config, across all of these things. And that's, a significant orchestration. And so what we are definitely seeing is companies wanting to put something between that. Or as we very affectionately say here at Cribl, we put Cribl in the middle. And
That's
so
amazing.
what that gives you is the things we've been talking about earlier, where you can quarterback much of the data to the appropriate places and duplicate it or triplicate it or truncate it and cut it and splice it. But it also allows you to say, hey, new source here, and from a central location very quickly push out a configuration to a cohort of systems. And I think that that's what a lot of that democratization was talking about, which is just not limiting you there. Or you are going to make a SIM purchase, you don't know who, you have a SIM in place, you can very quickly spin up multiple POCs on the same data set and then judge the efficacy of the tools off of exactly the same data. That's not capable with what has existed previously. So there's some really interesting potential. Like that's just our and my maybe short-term viewpoint as to what I'm seeing, and then also where I'm thinking it's going. But I'm starting to like imagine what other use cases I haven't thought of yet, or I haven't, borrowed or stolen from some other really smart person, as to what you can do with being able to move various data on certain elements to different locations at in seconds or minutes of time.
You just nailed like 50% of my job here at WEI is to address questions about SIM migration, because a lot of customers are looking at the SIM landscape and thinking about what their next step is going to be. And it's a big decision, for the point you made, that if you want to change your SIM, you have to touch every single log sender and point it to the new SIM. And POCs are tough because you can only point to one device at a time in some cases. So yeah, I think the democratization of data to me is this freeing from the grip of your all-knowing SIM vendor for sure.
Or
I
just
re-
the older technologies that exist, and it may not be the SIM vendor's fault. It might just be the tech that you still have, and so this will
Possibly.
unlock some of those things.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for the conversation. I had a great time. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Any closing thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with?
Yes, so I have a practice, a personal practice I've been doing for over a year, probably about a year and a half now. And it's that I spend about 15 minutes a day using a Gen AI technology. So I paid for an annual subscription of OpenAI last year, and this year is Perplexity. And I've really been enjoying it. I have no stake in the game in either one of these, no more than any other person who's walking this planet has a stake in this game. But every day I try to use it in some way, shape, or form, whether it is summarizing a website I want to read, or a PDF. That's probably maybe becoming more common. Um, but I would highly suggest that any one of you spend at least 15 minutes a day learning AIs, and sort of, not that I'm a huge fan of Google, but instead of using Google, or maybe side by side with one of these Gen AI technologies, will really give you an easy way in, and who knows, we'll see if it becomes part of your daily practice.
Awesome. I think that's a great thought, Mike. Thank you very much. If you'd like to learn more about any of the services that I mentioned that WEI can provide, wei.com. You can also reach us on LinkedIn. And if you would like to learn about Cribl, Cribl spelled CRIBL.io. Thank you very much for joining us, Myke Lyons. Really appreciate it. Have a good afternoon. Cheers.
Cheers off.